Hello everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa marhaba. Bonjour et bienvenue. Welcome to this interview for the Open Borders Institute in partnership with Europanova. We are a small advocacy with the goal of changing perspectives on cross-border exchanges. This week, we welcome Georgina Wright. Georgina is the director of the Europe program at French think tank Institut Montaigne and is a fellow of the German Marshall Fund of the United States and also one of the most trusted commentators of the Franco-British relationship. Before that, Georgina has worked for the British think tank Institute for Government and for Chatham House. She is also a regular commentator of politics for UK in the changing world, changing Europe. With a wonderful mastery of both French and English, we will interview her in the two languages and we'll speak about what it means for her to be a European who lives between Brussels, London, and Paris. Hello, Georgina.
Hi, Adam. Thank you very much for having me.
It is a pleasure. I saw that on Twitter you define yourself as a Bruxelloise. I'm curious about what it means for you to live between these three cities, what it means also to be someone who lives between the UK and France, or the UK and Belgium after Brexit. How do you see things?
So that's a very good question. I mean, I'm very much based in Paris now, but the luxury of being in Paris, working on EU affairs, is that you get to travel all around Europe. And being a think tanker, I make it my duty to sort of speak to as many people as possible to get their perspective on sort of the pressing challenges facing the EU. But yes, I grew up in Belgium and then sort of moved between the UK, studied between the UK and Belgium, and I've lived in several European countries. And I think, you know, those opportunities aren't given to everyone. So I feel very fortunate to have that. And I think the more time I spend in one country, I realize that actually there's a lot of like there are many stereotypes about that country that aren't particularly true, but also there are great things and great ways that countries complement each other. And I think you see that very much in the EU, where you have sort of 27 countries coming together with very different cultures, convergences on certain things, differences in others. But Europe, you know, is much broader than the EU, and so sort of getting that luxury of being able to spend time in different places is, I think, a really rich experience, and it's one I sort of hope that as many people as possible get to live.
Absolutely. At Open Borders Institute, we try to keep a perspective on Europe that is Europe-wide, so not only confined to the European Union. And actually, speaking about that, very interestingly, there's been the updated version of the report on the Defense Integrated Review that's led by Professor John Bew from King's College London. That version has included mentions of France and of the EU in much more depth. The previous version that was published focused a lot more on the Indo-Pacific. There's notably a map that shows the relationship between the UK and other countries within Europe. How do you see that development going, especially in the relationship between the UK and Europe?
So it's a very good question. I mean, you know, John Bew is first and foremost, of course, the Prime Minister's foreign policy advisor, the British Prime Minister's foreign policy advisor. So he's now, you know, been the foreign policy special advisor on foreign policy for 3 prime ministers. So he first joined the Johnson government and then stayed on during the Truss government and is now continuing with Prime Minister Sunak. So I think he is someone who has incredible sort of depth and experience in sort of analysing and understanding foreign policy. And I think that sort of shows, it showed in the first integrated review, and you know, he wasn't alone in writing it. He sort of, it was a real cross-government exercise, talking to sort of having as many, you know, as much input as possible from the Foreign Office, of course, but also other departments. And you're right, there is a difference between the sort of February 20 2021 strategy that came out, which was an attempt to sort of define global Britain, what it meant, what the UK's role in the world would be after, now that it had left the EU, and then the sort of 2023 refresh, which came out this week. And it's very interesting because you're right that there is a greater emphasis on the EU and the UK's role within it. I mean, the sort of February 21 strategy also talked about the UK's role in Europe. I think a lot of people exaggerated the Indo-Pacific tilt. I mean, it was very clear that the UK would continue to remain a security guarantor of Europe, and that's sort of come into full fruition, of course, with its support to Ukraine. But I think there was sort of the EU was not mentioned in it at all. And so I think this refresh is quite interesting because it does mention the EU. It does mention an openness to work more with the EU when their interests align. And I think that poses an interesting question for the EU and what it wants from its relationship with the UK, because a lot of the time we sort of focused on what the UK wants, but we haven't really focused on what the EU wants out of the EU. What the EU wants out of the UK. So it will be interesting to see over the next coming sort of months and years whether that's something that happens, whether we will see greater cooperation. And also there's a very important election taking place next year in the UK, and we might have a very different government in number 10. So I think a lot can change, but certainly it seems like the UK is on a path towards more constructive engagement with the EU.
And also more constructive engagement with its very close neighbor and partner, France. I've seen that just yesterday, Lord Peter Rickett was invited by Laurence Boone for intervening on a panel about the États généraux du Quai d'Orsay. We've also seen in the integrated review 22, I think it was 22 mentions of France. There's been the Franco-British summit. How's that evolving?
I think it's fair to say that Franco-British relations weren't in a very good place in the past 5 years, and that's because of a number of different issues. Brexit negotiations, where I think both sides, as much as possible, tried to isolate Brexit or isolate the bilateral relationship from Brexit. But inevitably, I think the toxicity of the negotiations sort of bled into the bilateral relationship. Many in the UK thought that if Brussels was being tough on the UK, it was predominantly because President Macron was asking for it. And equally, I think there was a sense in France that the UK was trying to bypass Brussels and go directly to different capitals to get what it wanted. So I think Brexit negotiations were a tricky moment for the relationship. But then, of course, there was the decision of the UK to go ahead with the United States and Australia and form the AUKUS security partnership, which of course meant that France got its submarine deal with Australia cancelled as a consequence, because Australia decided to go with nuclear submarines through this partnership of AUKUS. And then there are a number of sort of jibes and criticism over Twitter, some sort of French bashing in the UK, but also some kind of fierce criticism coming from Paris as well. I think it's safe to say that the relationship is in a much better place. We saw it last Friday when they hosted their first bilateral summit in 5 years. So these summits usually happen every 1 or 2 years. So it was really important that it did take place. There was sort of a sense that they were turning the page. They wanted to be ambitious about their relationship. There weren't that many announcements actually, but there's a lot of aspiration in the 13-page declaration, including doing more in the Middle East, coordinating presence in the Indo-Pacific, and of course continuing to support Ukraine, but also stuff around nuclear energy, civil nuclear energy, and reconnecting societies as well, because as Open Border Institute, you're sort of keen to kind of not make borders a barrier. And I think there is a sense that with Brexit and COVID, it was much more difficult for both societies, French people to travel to the UK and vice versa. And so there's a real willingness to kind of reconnect societies after those sort of those moments. So I think I'm sort of quite positive. We'll have to see if it pays off, but it certainly feels we're in a very different relationship right now, and a different sort of atmosphere as well.
I know that um, Sir Keir Starmer has expressed the fact that he would not come back on the negotiations of Brexit, on the deal that the UK had achieved. Nevertheless, I cannot but think after the general elections whether there could be a change depending on who will be in number 10 with regards to the single market. Do you think that we could see in the 5 years that are coming, maybe in the decade that's coming, a readmission, in new terms, of course, of the UK within the single market, or at least a partnership of the kind that Switzerland has with the EU?
I mean, I'd start off by saying that I don't think the EU really likes the setup it has with Switzerland. So I'm not sure it's very keen to replicate that. I mean, I, as a think tanker, pride myself in never giving kind of, I never place bets on anything. So I'm going to be cautious here as well. I think we need to remember that, British society has sort of had enough of Brexit. They don't really want to have to talk about this. And there is a sense of sort of willingness to get on with things, even though it might not always meet the expectations that everyone had, those who were pro-Brexit or those who were against it. Never say never, I think, is the other lesson we've had over the past couple of years, where we've seen a number of things happen across the world which we didn't think would, were possible and happened. And it might just be that we will see a future British government ask for readmission into the single market, a bit like Norway has, or rather than sort of rejoining the EU. But I don't, my sense, talking to politicians on both sides in the UK, is that's not where they're going, and there isn't a real sort of push in British society to rejoin the single market either. Now, that might be because it hasn't been suggested to them, but I certainly think we need to bear in mind that the willingness now is to really get on with things, to try and have a constructive relationship with the EU, but also to be able to seize some of those Brexit opportunities. And that's the government, but also the opposition have sometimes listed as and whether that's sort of more flexibility on what you do in the finance sector, more flexibility in terms of the partnerships that you create with countries around the world. So, maybe would be my answer, but I don't think, in a way, I think that's sort of a red herring, because we should be thinking about what might a more constructive relationship look like right now that is beneficial to the EU and to the UK, rather than sort of assuming that actually integration within the single market or a close relationship is necessarily the right way to go.
Of course, and the entente cordiale is way enough of a framework for the UK, for instance, and France, if we're just taking one bilateral relationship to advance towards a more amicable relationship. One of the, because we're speaking about bipartisan politics, and I've mentioned Labour and the Tories, there's an issue that also the Republicans and the Democrats in the US very much agree on, and it seems to be the position with regards to China having a tough position. AUKUS having being a program that's developing, there's been people saying on the French side, for instance, that it is a policy that's a little too antagonistic towards China. And there have been commentators on the Chinese side as well that are picturing this agreement as kind of proliferation within the Indo-Pacific. How do you see that?
I mean, I think the sort of watching the first AUKUS summit earlier this week, I mean, it clearly was about sort of, helping Australia to preserve its national security interests. And there is a real sense in Australia that, yes, China is a challenge, a systemic challenge. But I also think that you've heard it from the sort of Biden administration and the British government. Yes, their rhetoric towards China is sort of hardening, but equally there is a recognition that you can't sort of ignore China. There are a number of issues where you have to cooperate with China. And also that it's very difficult to simply sort of turn your back or decouple completely from China because of the integration in the world market. So I think I think we need to take the Australian sort of kind of perception of the threat very seriously. I don't think this is in any way trying to isolate China. I think this is a pact design, and in fact it does much more than simply respond to sort of Australia's threat perception. It's also about strengthening the security of undersea cables, which are being sort of threatened by a number of different actors. It's also about sort of security of navigation. There are a number of things in there, so we'll have to see how it develops. But I think you're right to say that there is a bipartisan view in Washington that is growing, sort of very critical of China and China's dominance, particularly around supply chains for critical raw materials. And there is an attempt there to sort of safeguard access to these critical raw materials, which will be essential to a number of future sort of technologies and existing technologies that will be essential for our future. So I think this is something we'll need to watch out for. And you see the EU as well, just this week adopt a new act designed to kind of as well sort of protect its supply chains and make sure it has access to what it needs. So I think this is much broader than simply China as a systemic challenge, and I think the next couple of years will be really defining in how each of these blocks positions itself, and also the rest of the world.
Speaking of decoupling, there's been a very interesting piece that was published in Le Grand Continent on the 15th of March by a scholar called Nicolas Mulder. And he was arguing that this decoupling of the European Union was a threat to global stability. There's also this book by Martin Wolf, who's the economics editor for the Financial Times, with regards to this age of liberalism that is kind of fragmenting and this process of deglobalization. How do you see that effect of decoupling on peace worldwide? Do we need those interdependencies for assuring the stability of the international system?
Well, there's a school of thought that certainly thinks that actually, the more integrated you are, sort of the greater it is for diplomacy links, and for sort of simply being able to kind of speak to each other, corporations. There's definitely a strong school of thought that thinks that. I think that you are seeing kind of a new not school of thought, but a new apprehension about being that sort of says yes to having integrated supply chains, and that's just how the global market works, but we shouldn't have over dependence. So it's not about in a way, it's not about being dependent or not, or completely isolated. It's about not being over dependent, because particularly for critical minerals that are key to the technologies that will ensure your long-term competitiveness. So I think it's not, I don't really, in my view, I don't really sense anyone saying we have to completely decouple from China. That's not what I'm hearing. What I'm hearing is we have to be less dependent on China and other countries, that we have to stop being over dependent on those to ensure our supply. So I think it's more around that, and I think I don't really see a world where we kind of return to I don't want to say the Middle Ages, because even the Middle Ages had kind of very astute and strong trade routes, but a way where you're just like producing or kind of trading with your friends. I think that we are in a world where we are increasingly globalized. I think the question is more, how do we prevent over dependence?
Janet Yellen from the US Treasury has talked about friendshoring in this specific case, and the European Union, the UK, and the US are definitely friends who are meant to stick together and for each other. At the same time, the Inflation Reduction Act has been welcomed as a very aggressive move from the US administration towards the European Union. How do you see those things advancing together? Both the very close relationship, much better than under the Trump administration with Biden, and at the same time, this lack of I would say consideration maybe for the European Union when the Inflation Reduction Act was launched.
I mean, how long do you have, Adam? Because this is an incredibly long and complicated subject, but I'm really glad you asked me about it. I mean, I just published a piece for Institut Montaigne, which is available in English and will be available in French very soon, on sort of the different motivations behind the Inflation Reduction Act and why the United States didn't consult many of its sort of friends and allies. I think the first thing that the Inflation Reduction Act says or confirms is that the United States, like China, has no qualms in placing national preference at the heart of its industrial policy, and that basically means that it's quite willing to support its industry in critical sectors, even if that goes against global trade rules that sort of say we should not be overly supporting our industry because that could upset the kind of balance between different markets and it distorts competition. I think we've seen China doing it for years now, and now we're seeing the United States doing it, not in sort of, both are not doing it in all the sectors, but they do appear to be doing it for strategic sectors. I think this bill is very, very complex. It's predominantly there to kind of strengthen the green tech sector in the United States. And the Biden administration believes that by doing that, by creating market incentives, they will sort of not create a green revolution, but sort of, not far off that. And that actually, that's the only way to bring down the United States emissions and sort of meet or surpass its climate targets for 2030. So it's like by bringing business with you, by creating new opportunities for renewables and carbon-free fuels and all the rest of it. So they want to create those markets and the innovation to be able to meet their climate targets. So that's number one. Number two, there's also a security imperative. And we were just talking about lessening dependence on China. I think that's quite clear in this bill as well, where they're sort of trying to promote production or sourcing in the United States, or to sort of privilege sourcing from countries with which the United States has a trade agreement. Now, of course, it doesn't have a trade agreement with the EU, and which is part of the problem. But you do see an attempt to try and kind of be again sort of not overly dependent on China or other countries, and try and privilege and put preference in sourcing in the United States or in countries with which you have a trade agreement. And then there's the third sort of imperative behind this, which is really political, which is Joe Biden promised, was elected on the promise that he would create more wealth and create more jobs. This is an opportunity to create more jobs, and potentially a very big opportunity to create more wealth too. And I think there's a view in Washington that actually by maximizing and really strengthening the green tech sector, you're going to have loads of competition, which will bring prices down globally, not just in the United States. And so if you look at sort of all of that, and then there's also stuff in there about bringing down inflation, about supporting, healthcare and health bills, and bringing down the prices of drugs and all sorts of things. It's a really complex piece of legislation, and to get it through Congress, it really requires some sort of nifty writing in the bill, and also a lot of negotiation, which simply, that was the focus. It was to get it through the United States, which partly explains also, I think, why there weren't extensive conversations with the EU. The Biden administration is trying to rectify some of the problems there, to try, because what we've seen is basically industry in Europe thinking, well, great, I want to move over there. I get access to all this assistance and money, and also energy bills are a lot lower. The dollar is really strong. The market's really big. This is like a great opportunity. And so the Biden administration is trying to sort of rectify some of that, but it won't be able to change fundamentally the bill. And I think, again, you know, the United States is doing what China has done for a long time. So I sort of, you know, feel that this is sadly, or not sadly, but this is just the way things are going now. And so I think the EU's response is right to think about how it can support its own industry while also remaining open, because there are lots of countries around the world that cannot support their industry the way that the United States or China can, or in fact the EU. So we'll see.
And speaking of passing the Senate, there is a bill this time in France that has passed the Senate, and it has passed the Parliament through an executive order, and that is the pension reform. Oyanda is here with us. We'll ask you a question in French related to this.
Georgina, comme vous le savez, hier, le gouvernement français a passé par le 49.3 la réforme des retraites françaises et outrepassé la volonté parlementaire. Ce passage en fort, qui était craint par les citoyens français depuis des mois, a embrasé la France et les rues de Paris. Certains politiques et journalistes vantent cette réforme, qu'ils disent financière et symbolique, comme étant une solution au déficit budgétaire et à la dette française. Ils disent aussi, d'un point de vue européen, que c'est un moyen de continuer à peser sur l'échiquier européen. Parmi les partenaires principaux de la France, on pense notamment à l'Allemagne. Que pensez-vous de cette retraite et pensez-vous en effet qu'elle fait partie des éléments clés et essentiels permettant de garder une puissance française au sein de l'échiquier européen?
Merci beaucoup, Oyane. C'est une excellente question. Moi, je pense qu'il y a plusieurs choses. Il y a la première, c'est est-ce que cette réforme est nécessaire ou pas? Je ne suis analyste, et donc j'observe les choses, je les analyse. Mon opinion ne compte pas vraiment là-dedans, mais ce qui est clair, c'est que le président avait été élu avec la promesse de réformer, un, l'État, et de deux, de réduire la dette, et trois, de passer des réformes qui seraient assez ambitieuses, mais qui permettraient de réduire la dette française. On voit aussi que l'influence de la France, enfin moi je constate que la conversation européenne, le débat européen n'a jamais été aussi français, mais que néanmoins, un des reproches qu'on fait à la France, et notamment l'Allemagne pense cela, même si elle ne le dit pas publiquement, c'est que la dette est beaucoup trop grande et que ça pose un risque, et par ailleurs, ça nuit un petit peu à la crédibilité de la France. C'est-à-dire que quand elle est à Bruxelles et qu'elle dit, bon, ben, vous devez faire ceci, vous devez faire cela, il y a beaucoup d'États membres qui disent, ben, vous aussi, vous devez réduire votre dette. Et on entend beaucoup de pression. Dans le passé, il y a eu beaucoup de pression sur l'Italie, sur l'Espagne, etc. La France en est sortie, mais pour autant, sa dette est très élevée. Donc, je pense que ça faisait partie des promesses électorales du président. Et par ailleurs, c'était aussi listé comme une priorité pour le gouvernement Borne. Donc, je pense que adresser le problème de la dette et passer les réformes de l'État sont inévitables. Ça, c'est une chose. Et puis, il y a l'autre chose de comment le gouvernement s'y est pris, qui semble aussi agacer beaucoup de Français, c'est-à-dire que, comme vous l'avez dit, de entre guillemets, passer outre le Parlement, même s'il y a quand même eu de longs débats, hein, il ne faut pas l'oublier, il y a eu un vote au Sénat. Et par ailleurs, c'est une réforme qui semble vraiment déplaire à beaucoup de Français. Je pense que c'est très difficile aujourd'hui de savoir ce qui va se passer. On pourra avoir une motion de censure. Si elle passe, on verrait le gouvernement tomber. Et là, ça pourrait être une façon d'arrêter cette réforme, de mettre fin à cette réforme. En même temps, on ne voit pas du tout une majorité au sein de l'Assemblée nationale pour voter cette motion de censure. Donc il faudra voir. Mais en tout cas, ça atteint politiquement en fait la réputation du gouvernement et effectivement, il y a une opposition de plus en plus grande et de plus en plus vocale qui reproche au gouvernement de ne pas faire assez attention au Parlement. Mais je pense qu'il faut vraiment s'intéresser au débat de l'Assemblée nationale. Moi, je le fais parce que voilà, ça m'intéresse, mais aussi parce que ça fait partie de mon travail. Mais je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de débats qui ont lieu. Il faudra vraiment attendre la suite pour voir ce qui se passe.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Georgina. On the 27th of March, we will be organizing with Europa Nova and Tribune ESCP an event called La Semaine de l'Europe at ESCP Business School in Paris. The event consists in a week-long series of roundtables with guest speakers such as Alberto Alemano and Anne-Cécile Robert, who we have already hosted here at the Open Borders Institute, but also the French Minister of Culture, Abdulrim Malak, the Dean of the Sciences Po School of International Affairs and previous Spanish Foreign Minister, Mrs. Arantxa González, Mr. Clément Beaune, French Minister of Transport, Michel Barnier, previous chief Brexit negotiator, and Mr. Raffarin, former French Prime Minister. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much, Georgina Wright.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you very much, Oyan and Julie, who's sort of hiding here on the Zoom call as well. Thank you very much for having me. It was a great conversation, wide-ranging, but I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunities to discuss all of this again.
Thank you, Georgina.